The agenda in the summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Everyone's actions change or at least influence the world in some way. But few of us truly change the course of history. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Tonight, we return to a conversation with Russian leader Mikhail Gorbachev about his country and the post-Cold War era he helped usher in. Also, our Ontario Hubs recall the origins of comic book publishing in World War II era Canada. The former and last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, celebrated his 90th birthday this past March. As much as he's well regarded in the West, Russians are still split on what they think about the man who made possible the breakup of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism across Eastern Europe. In a Pew poll conducted in 2017, just 22% of Russian adults said he had a positive role in history. Meanwhile, 58% said Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin played a positive role. In this interview from 2005, Gorbachev mentions Russian President Vladimir Putin and calls Russia an evolving democracy. More than a decade and a half later, Putin is still president of Russia and has signed a law allowing him to stay in office until 2036. In 2012, reflecting on this interview, Steve Paikin wrote that Gorbachev was, quote, the single most important person I've ever interviewed, and said that from the first moment they met, he sensed he was, quote, in the presence of greatness. Here's that conversation.
Let us talk about some of the changes that have happened in Asia, in the region of the world that you used to represent. We have seen in the last year and a half popular uprisings that have toppled governments in Georgia, in Ukraine, and in Kyrgyzstan. To what do you attribute these peaceful, relatively peaceful revolutions?
Ну, во-первых, все-таки
First of all,
надо иметь в виду, что
you have to bear in mind that this period of change, the transition from one system to another, it's not over. And actually, it's perhaps only halfway.
What else do you anticipate?
нет, я имею в виду, что, знаете, ну,
What I have in mind that, well, first you get freedom. After you are free, what happens? You don't know what to do with that freedom. There are democratic institutions that have been created, and you have the right to vote, to choose freely. But you're not familiar with this whole thing, and there is no real electoral order in the country, no real political parties in the country. This is a process that happens in a very bureaucratic environment. The privatization of property is accompanied by a lot of corruption, and people wanted freedom to give them happiness. People were waiting for happiness, and since they didn't see it, they sometimes even go beyond democratic procedures and just break things, so to say. And therefore, sometimes in one day there is a leap. And instead of an evolutionary transition, there are revolutionary moments. There's what happened in Ukraine. Whatever they say, probably everyone was involved a little bit, Russia, America, and others. I'm familiar enough with those things. In Georgia, too, there was some involvement from abroad, but it is domestic, the domestic sources of the discontent, the poverty, the great poverty in which people live. And that's why those regimes that were not able to give them a better life were swept away.
Let me follow up on that notion, because some people in the United States would suggest that the president's so-called freedom doctrine has had a lot to do with what has transpired in the world. The notion that Iraq is moving towards a freer society, that other Arab societies are doing so, and that these countries as well. Would you say that that doctrine, as put forward by George W. Bush, is having influence?
Это точка зрения, оценки.
Well, this is the view, I'm sure, promoted by President Bush and his people. My own view is different, and that is that what we saw in Iraq is war and the destruction of the country, and it should have been handled politically. They were looking for weapons of mass destruction, and the president said this is why we will wage war. But they didn't find weapons of mass destruction. They were looking for those weapons of mass destruction for many, many months, etc. Well, the CIA is supposed to do it well, to find WMD and drugs and whatever. They didn't find it. So in the end, they didn't find it, and then they said, well, but after all, it's so good that we put an end to that regime. Well, some people don't like the American government, so should people destroy the American government? Of course, it's a joke. I respect America, the American government, and the democratic achievements of that country. But this is not the way to go. We should not really try to impose democracy or good government, because in the end, the regimes that are the product of this are the regimes that are bought, the sellout regimes. And I'm saying that very frankly.
Does America's unique dominance in the world today disturb you?
Меня только беспокоит не
Well, what I'm concerned about is not that there is a leader in the world. Indeed, it is a leader in the world on many scores. What I am concerned about is how America will use this unique position. If America were to try, and I think that it did try to impose its vision of the world, its order, its standards, well, that will not happen. They will not succeed, let me assure you. And this did not happen in Yugoslavia. They just destroyed the country. They were not successful in Iraq. I know what happened in Afghanistan. The Soviet leadership invaded Afghanistan in order to establish their own order. And in a country that has a clan system, and after all, the traditions of that country, in that country, they tried to impose communism or socialism, and that was stupid. It was ridiculous. And I think that something similarly ridiculous is happening when our friends, our American friends and partners, are trying to impose their will in Iraq. And I am saying that to them openly, because they should avoid more such mistakes. Let us not act using methods that were used in the 20th century, and we know what the result was, the death of millions of people. So now we are living in a global world, and let us live in this global world according to new rules, and no one will be able to act in ways of hegemony, of domination. Domination will not be accepted. Russia will not accept domination.
I want to pick up on that. I want to pick up on that issue of whether Russia would accept domination. Do you believe that the West is trying actively to hold Russia down right now?
У меня такое мнение. Вы употребили мое слово, поэтому вы знаете.
Well, that is probably, you heard me saying that indeed the West, including Americans, even though I very positively evaluate the contacts between our presidents, President Bush and President Putin, they are continuing their dialogue, and that dialogue is very important. And a lot of good things are being said toward Russia in Western Europe. 55% of Russia's trade is with Western Europe, so tremendous resources are being exchanged. And so it would seem that we are the closest of friends. We're all Europeans. But I do have the impression that it's all fine, let Russia move forward, but slowly, not too fast. Let Russia be bogged down in Chechnya and some other place, and let that continue for some time. Well, it seems to me that some people in the West are still afraid of Russia. It's a mistake to think that Russia has not changed. But there is another reason. Russia is a competitor. Russia is an educated country, well-educated people, tremendous resources, perhaps half the resources of the world are in Russia. And if that country gains momentum, it will be a competitor. In a very competitive market, there will be another competitor. So some people in the West think pragmatically, let Russia be down as long as possible. But that would not be, in my opinion, the best style of handling relations with Russia. The best style is partnership, alliance, and friendship. A calm Russia, a stable Russia, a successfully developing democratic Russia is a lot better than an unstable Russia, a Russia from which there is always a source of concern.
You're quite right, obviously, that Russia has changed significantly from the days when you were in charge. But is it, in your view today, a democracy?
I think that it's an evolving democracy, an emerging democracy, and what we achieved during the years of perestroika has in some cases evolved further. In some cases there's been some backtracking, but generally Russia, I think, is moving with some difficulty to overcome those problems, that it is moving toward a democratic society, a democratic state. But it will be a special kind of democracy. Russia has 9 time zones, a huge country. In Russia there is always a need for strong central government, strong central leadership, given that Russia contains many nations, many ethnic groups that need the central government to take their specificity into account, because it's not just ethnic Russians who live in Russia, even though a majority, of course, are ethnic Russians after the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I believe that central government in Russia will have to be strong. But at the same time, of course, there should be a very democratic relationship between the center and the regions, between the local self-government and the center. And in this direction, there is some movement in Russia. I believe that the most important thing today, though, is to put an end to poverty in Russia, because it is amazing, a country so rich in resources, a so well-educated country. Here in Toronto, you have 200,000 Russians working here. In America, a lot more, of course, and everyone praises those Russians. I heard President Bush saying that the Russians are good workers, disciplined workers, talented workers. So in this country, we need to develop a kind of society, a kind of a functioning economy, which would stimulate the people to work.
I can also tell you that the Russians who are here in Toronto, some of them are very good hockey players. But that's another story.
Well, that's an old story and a good story. Canadians and Russians can play hockey, sure.
Let me ask you some more personal questions, if I may. Your popularity here in my country and in the United States, just south of us, is much higher than it is in your native Russia. Can you tell us what it is like to be admired more by the people who used to be your enemies than by those who used to be your fellow homelanders?
It's the same question, and they asked me about the presidential election in which I got less than 1% of the vote in 1996. Well, first of all, let me tell you that the situation is changing. It's changing quite rapidly. It's been 20 years since the beginning of perestroika, and the polls show that people understand the need for perestroika a lot more. In Russia, of course, the heaviest blow was the breakup of the Soviet Union. That really was a heavy blow, and 60% of as economists believe that 60% of the problems that we are facing today are because of the breakup of the Union. And many people think that it was because of perestroika that Gorbachev broke up the country. It is, of course, the interruption of perestroika that was the first step toward the breakup. In perestroika, we thought that we could preserve the Union while decentralizing it, while giving more rights to the republics, to the regions, while giving them incentives. What happened with Boris Yeltsin was quite different, because ultimately it was for Russia to decide whether the Union were to be preserved. And Yeltsin's approach was quite different. His concept was that Russia should get rid of the other republics, and that we, the Russians, will be able to live a lot better, because now we give 100 billion to the republics as part of the Union. If we shed that weight, we will become a prosperous country in 3 or 4 years. It was a delusion, it was a mistake, and it was ignorance to think so. And the result was that they did something reckless, a misadventure. It was the shock of reforms in an unprepared country. The country was opened up, and therefore they broke up the country and they broke down the economy. And the Russians and people in other republics have been affected. The situation is not a lot better in most of the other republics, with the exception of the Baltic states, which are also rather poor. But that's why the response, the reaction is different. In America, in China, in other countries, they praise perestroika more than in my country, because people are going through a lot of hardships. But now people are beginning to change their view. Yeltsin wanted power. He wanted to become the boss, and that's why he broke up the Union, and the result was quite tragic. Well, I think it's inevitable that people understand and come to appreciate processes like perestroika, which affect our country and the entire world, gradually. When the Prime Minister of China, Zhou Enlai, was still alive, he talked to a French delegation, and the French asked him, "Mr. Prime Minister, what do you think? What is your evaluation of the impact of the French Revolution on the world and on China?" And that was about 180 years after the French Revolution, and he said, "Well, it's too soon to tell." And perestroika, well, I must say it was perhaps even a bigger project, and it's too soon to tell.
My final question I'd like to ask you about communism itself. After everything you have seen and lived through and learned, do you believe that some version of communism is still a defensible idea?
Абсолютно верно.
Well, I would say so, absolutely. As a utopia, as an ideal that cannot be achieved, it will continue to be attractive to younger people. Young people in Russia, in Europe, and in the world are attracted to it as an ideal. It doesn't mean leveling off everything, equalizing everything as the Bolsheviks did. This equalization resulted in everyone being poor. But there are principles that the government should follow, looking for a balance of interest and looking for less of a gap in income. I feel that the social democratic project is the most flexible answer to this question, because it protects private property and private initiative, but at the same time it is very sensitive to the social problems, to the problems of the people.
Mr. Gorbachev, it is very good of you to spend so much time with us. Spasiba, spasiba, spasiba.
It's been 80 years since the first traditional-style comic book was published here in Canada. A Hamilton historian is among those helping an effort to mark the occasion. Justin Chandler covers the Hamilton-Niagara region for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us from Hamilton with the fine print on that. Hey, Justin.
Hey there.
All right, Justin, with a Twitter handle like Mr. Lois Lane, it was only a matter of time before we started talking about comic books. And of course, for people who are not familiar, your Twitter handle is sort of a tribute to Lois Lane, a fictional character in the Superman comics, Superman's love interest, but more importantly, an award-winning journalist. So very fitting.
Exactly.
But we're going to be talking about Canadian comics today. Not much is known about its history. So maybe get us started. What do we need to know?
So this period that we're talking about, wartime Canadian comics, really started, like you said, in 1941. And the reason for this, as the reason for many things in Canada, is because of bureaucratic, essentially. So during the war, there was this act called the War Exchange Conservation Act that banned the import of non-essential goods. And included in those were pulp magazines and comic books. So suddenly the American comic books like Superman and Batman that had really started kicking things off in 1939 were no longer available to Canadian kids. So what that meant was that Canadian publishers had an opportunity, and almost right away they started making books. So by 1941, the first Canadian traditional style floppy comic was published. And when I say floppy style, I mean kind of like this. So a traditional, like what you think of as a book now, that it's bends, not the first comic, but the first in that style that we all know and love today.
Now, I understand these comics are very rare to find now. I want to pull a cover of the Better Comic #1. Tell us about this.
So Better Comics #1, this was where it started. This was the first book with the cover date of March 1st, 1941. It was created by a publisher in BC. His name was Vernon Miller, and his publishing company was called Maple Leaf. And it was a story that included some interesting characters like the superhero Iron Man, not the Iron Man that you might know from Marvel today, but this Iron Man who was like an ocean-dwelling superhero who fought Nazis and crime, and as well just some other anthology stories. So it was also notably mostly in black and white. And that was actually the case with most of these wartime comic books that started coming after that because it was a lot cheaper to print.
Now, I'm sure there are going to be some comic book collectors who are watching this who are like, okay, wait, hold on. How do I get my hands on them? And I'm just curious, is there sort of a price tag on these comics as well?
That's hard to say. I don't know about how much they would actually go for if you were able to buy one, because they are so hard to find. Like the comic book historian that I talked to learn about all of this, Ivan Kukmarek, what he was telling me was that with some of these books, there's fewer than 10 in existence. And because the industry came and went so fast, like after the war, when American books started coming in, all these Canadian publishers folded. So in some cases, there's fewer than 10 of any of these books in existence, and people didn't really save them in the same way or even know about them. So they're rare, but they don't have the same prestige as a 1940s Batman or Superman comic might.
Now, Justin, you spoke to Ivan for this piece. Let's have a look at what he had to say.
Well, if we take a look at Better Comics #1, it started off with stories that seemed to come more from British annuals that were out at the time, boys' annuals and girls' annuals, dealing with adventurers, tinkering scientists, cowboys, detectives, but not the garish superheroes that were south of the border, like Superman, Batman, and all Captain Marvel and everything. Though Better #1 introduced the first Canadian superhero. He was called the Iron Man. And he was actually a denizen of the ocean. He came from a civilization that had been sunk and now lived in a bubble city somewhere in the South Seas. And he was more a clone of, say, the Submariner that we know today in Aquaman. He would come up and fight the Nazis and help out people against crime. And that was the Iron Man, invented by Vernon Miller, who was the architect, the BC architect behind Better Comics #1.
Now, you obviously are a comic book aficionado. I'm sure you loved that conversation with Ivan there. Was there anything that struck you about what he was saying there?
Well, it was interesting to hear. One of the things he told me was that how the Canadian comics took, like he said, that tradition a little bit more from the English side and that sort of annual rather than the American side. So while there were still superheroes like that Iron Man character that he mentioned, books were maybe a little bit different than what you might think of. And I mean, I'm always telling people comic books are a medium, they're not a genre, but we do know mostly superhero comics. Those are some of the most popular selling comic books. So it was just interesting to see that Canadian books at that time were taking a little bit of a different approach than American books were.
Now, Ivan also says those comic books could be considered an early social network. How so?
Well, this part was really fascinating. Essentially, a lot of comic books, ever since they started, had sort of letters to the editor in the same way that newspapers or magazines would, and they would have places where people could write in and publish things. And what Ivan says was that a lot of the books in this time period were actually encouraging readers from all across the country to write in, but also to become pen pals with one another, or to do things to help the war effort, like collecting scrap or doing paper drives. And so they were actually, in a way, connecting people across the country. There were publishers in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, but people all across were reading and were actually able to interact and connect because of these books.
Now, I understand Ivan's sort of taken it upon himself to preserve this rare moment in Canadian comic book history. Tell us about that.
Yes, he says it's his mission to teach more people about these wartime comics. And so part of what he's trying to do is actually to reprint Better Comics #1 in sort of a collector's format. And so he says he's in touch with the family of Vernon Miller, who's the one who published the book, and with some archives. And basically he's trying to get access and put this book out to the world so that people can read it again.
Now, I understand there is a society called the Society for the Promotion of Canadian Comics. Who are they, and how else is Ivan and that organization trying to preserve this legacy?
So this is a collection of comic book enthusiasts and academics. Ivan's a member of the group, and they're working in order to try and teach more people about this history and to just promote Canadian comics more generally. And so part of an effort for that is, for example, they worked on a magazine, Sequential Canadian Independent Comics Magazine is a book that publishes information about indie comics in Canada. They did a special history issue as part of this effort, and they're also working towards an academic conference.
I do want to end off on this one question. Now, of course, we all know that Justin is pretty synonymous to comics. That's how I know you. But did you know about this Canadian history before, or is this also your mission to preserve this legacy as well?
Yeah, this was all new to me, so I'm very excited to be telling more people about this. I do consider myself maybe an amateur comics historian, but most of what I know about is the American comics. And despite doing a lot of modern reporting on Canadian comics and people making books today, I didn't know about this 1940s history, and I'm very glad that I do now.
Well, Justin, I want to thank you so much for that history on Canadian literacy and comics. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's it for tonight's Agenda in the Summer. I'm Jay Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a good weekend, and NAM will see you again on Monday.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.